Hi, welcome to another episode of the Bonsai Wire podcast. I am Jonas Dupuich, here with
Eric Schrader.
And Eric, what are we here to talk about today?
Well, I have been in the midst of launching an online e-course about growing Shohin Japanese black pine. And because of that, you and I have been in a little bit more communication about things other than the Pacific Bonsai Expo.
Yeah. And we've been trying to figure out what has worked better and what has not worked as well in trying to teach pine, because we've both been learning how to grow pines from scratch as well as teaching it for a whole lot of years. And we wanted to kind of share what we've been thinking about, as we have yet to come up with some easy answers for what the most effective way is to teach some of these ideas.
It might be interesting to start with talking about how we both started learning, which was I was in a club. I was in the San Francisco club, and there was nobody there that seemed to understand how to make a pine work or cut it back or anything like that. And I ended up going to a BIB show and then joining Bale and Bonsai and starting to do workshops with Boone. And he definitely knew how to grow pine and how to cut it back. So that was the starting point for me.
Mine was very simple. I remember brand new to bonsai, I asked Boone, and I shared the story a lot, why aren't there more pine bonsai? And he said, well, we can't import those. And I thought to myself, well, if we don't start some now, we'll never have them. And so we started that first batch of seeds armed with nothing more than Bonsai Today 12 and 20. And we started seeds in his kitchen back in, I think it was February of 1994.
So if you think about the way that you and I learned how to do black pine bonsai, it was really hands-on and in person for the most part, in 4-hour or 8-hour long workshops with Boone or other teachers. And so seems like it was an effective way to teach how to work on black pines. Do you think that it's the most effective way?
Yeah, and I think there's even multiple components to that, in that we were both doing it and we were getting feedback from someone that had broader bonsai experience. I think those are the kind of two pieces. We didn't have an internet to turn to. There was no YouTube at the time. There were no websites at the time. And literally a couple of articles in magazines were our starting points. And honestly, everything other than the step we were at was academic at that point.
I mean, the thing about those articles, though, is that they're sort of an overview of the growing process, starting from seed all the way to, say year 6 or 10 or something like that. And I remember looking at the one I don't remember the one from number 12, but from Bonsai Today, number 20, I definitely remember. And as soon as I actually started growing black pines and got to about year 3 or 4, all of a sudden the article was like, wait, it just went from year 3 to done. And there's information in here about how to wire the trunk, and there's information about all this other stuff, but there's something missing here in the middle. And Boone wasn't really teaching us that either. He wanted a trunk that he could work with so that he could put branches on it. But he, in terms of positioning the branches proactively on a trunk that you're growing, that wasn't even something that we were thinking about either in workshop, or it's not covered in those articles.
And it also, at the time, at least, I knew nothing about not only what the structure of a pine should be, but how to do any of that work, because I was brand spanking new. I knew how to keep a seedling alive. You water it before it gets too dry, and give it some sun. That might have been the extent of my knowledge when I started this whole thing.
Well, I remember the thing that puzzled me for years, and I think this is pre-internet, and Boone didn't really answer it for me. Not to knock on Boone if Boone is listening, because he had a lot of great knowledge about black pines and how to maintain them and whatnot. But I remember starting seedlings and getting that first year's worth of growth. So you get kind of like the seedling coming up, and then you get another spurt of growth, and then it's sort of done for the year. And then in the second year, all of a sudden you're getting like 8 or 10 inches worth of growth and this giant whirl of buds at the top by the middle of summer or something like that, because you're not decandling, because you're trying to, just let the seedling get some momentum to it. And then in year 3, all of those buds starting at that whorl would branch out, and all of a sudden I've got a junction that I can no longer use but I can't cut it off because I need to have the
Something to
sacrifice
cut back
branch
to.
on. And I don't like, so I was just completely baffled by that whole situation.
What I think what ended up happening, and I didn't realize it at the time, we needed to kind of have something that made no sense, a single shoot that split off into too many shoots. And then you need to kind of work with it for a few years to kind of get through that awkward stage to realize what you should have done a few years previously. At least that's how I think most of my lessons worked. And that's what I will call a 3 or 4 year lesson is I'll realize, oh, I should have done this 3 or 4 years ago. Because it's really hard to just guess. I'd say the number one thing when working with other people that they're confused about is they'll show me a picture of a tree just as you described, but 1 year later, say you're 4 maybe or 3, where you've got this tree that's now maybe 12 to 24 inches tall, and 100% of the old needles and old buds are gone, and already the
Right.
tree's there's nothing you can do with it other than graft. You can make a nice tree, but there's no opportunity for taper. There's no opportunity for buds. There's no opportunity for shohin, and you're only 3-4 years in.
And you like, so if you haven't bent the trunk at that point, you're totally screwed in terms of making a small tree anyway. You just have to be satisfied with a larger tree because the bends are all going to be gradual with that much wood in the trunk at that point. But yeah, I mean, if you don't cut back any of the branching by the middle of year 4, you've got something that's starting to look like a Christmas tree or maybe an upside down Christmas tree. And all of those branches are just completely useless, essentially, in terms of making a small tree. It is crazy counterintuitive the way that people in Japan go about, the growers that are actually making these from scratch, the way they go about making them. It's almost like a cartoon it just looks like a flagpole sticking out of a bush.
Yeah. And what's funny is there's different ways to do those sacrifice branches even, where sometimes you can keep just that one central leader and sometimes you can keep all kinds of branches up high. And so for the first 20 years, I think I kept most of the branches on those sacrifice branches. That shaded out a lot down below and I didn't get many back buds. It was only not that many years ago when I knew I had more trees than would fit in my garden. So to squeeze them all in, I cut everything down to a single central leader because I thought, there's probably a reason every single article in every Japanese magazine keeps, for the most part, one branch on top. There are some exceptions. And when I tried it, I realized that it actually had a huge effect on the bottom of the tree.
I actually remember seeing in Chris Kirk's Telperion farm operation that same thing at a much larger size and larger scale.
Yes.
Because he was doing so many trees. But he literally, I have a picture of him standing in the midst of like a bunch of flagpoles, essentially, with bonsai at the bottom. And so, but I think at the time we were there, I wasn't even thinking about it that way because I was doing the same thing you're talking about, where I want the sacrifice branch to make as much wood as possible. So I'm leaving all the side branches on the sacrifice branch and then just spacing all of the trees out further so that the lower stuff isn't getting shaded. But pretty quickly, the lower stuff gets weak anyway because of all the hormone inhibition. And so if you're not cutting back the sacrifice branch on the sides and sort of keeping that one central leader, it seems like you're sort of shooting yourself in the foot and making it so it's going to be a grafting project pretty soon.
That's right. And so if the whole process of growing a pine or growing really any tree from scratch, but specifically pines with sacrifice branches, I'd say of the top 5 or 10 bullet points of things that matter, one of them is keeping in mind the balance between the top of the tree, that growth at the end of the sacrifice, and the growth down below. It's actually not necessary to do it, but it can save you from grafting and speed things up.
I mean, now I'm growing with a batch of 3+. I mean, they're in their 4th growing season, and I'm going to say that I have about 2,000 of them in 6-inch pond baskets, and they're all stacked right next to each other, right? So it took me over a week to go through and thin out all of those sacrifice branches, and all I'm doing is cutting off like a couple things off of each tree. It's not like some major trimming operation. But in the end, it becomes like a pretty large volume worth of foliage, like wheelbarrows full of pine branches that I'm cutting off. And I just think, you still do get trees where you don't have any lower buds. And it reminds me of what I was saying earlier, where I was looking at that whorl at the end of the second year's worth of growth, not knowing what to do with it. And I think what I ended up figuring out wasn't because anybody taught me, but because one of the trees that I had got damaged by accident. And then the sacrifice branch was essentially dead. And so all of these buds popped out all over the lower trunk. And I just looked at it like, wow, that looks like a giant pincushion now. Like every needle, every pair of needles that was down lower on the trunk, and even some of the areas where there had been bracts but no needles, pops buds. And I've actually started using that to my advantage. So if you have a 3-year-old or 4-year-old black pine and you're just sort of like, well, I don't really want to have to graft this, you can just basically lop off the entire sacrifice branch, and assuming that the tree is actually healthy and vigorously growing.
And you have needles down there.
Sometimes they'll bud even when you don't have needles down there when they're vigorous. But yeah, cut them back to some needles, and then all of a sudden you've got like 100 branches.
Yep.
But no sacrifice.
That's right. And so I think that was the big insight, is that the tree knows how much it wants to grow in a given season. It knows how many needles it wants to end the growing season with. And so if you remove those needles, whether through pulling needles or cutting branches, it's going to do everything it can to produce that foliage. And if you limit the opportunities for where that foliage can grow, you can start to control where it shows up. And that's what I learned when I cut down to that 1 liter up top. It started producing tons and tons of buds down below, and you could still keep that sacrifice branch. And the more you cut up top, the more you'd get down below, to the point where if that whole sacrifice comes off, that's like your complete punt. It may slow down your sacrifice branch, but you'll be rewarded with buds at just about every needle on the tree will produce a bud.
Now I have a question for you, actually. Have you ever, I just did this for the first time the other day, where you've already thinned down the sacrifice branch so that it's just the one central trunk extension. And so it's June right now, and we're in the midst of decandling and thinning black pines, depending on what stage they are. So decandling older ones and maybe a couple of branches on younger ones, and then thinning out those sacrifice branches. But I had never actually gotten, with the more pines you have, the more scenarios come up. And this one for me was, okay, all the growth down below looks weak, even though I've thinned out the sacrifice branch. So how can I kick it up without just taking the sacrifice off? So what I did was, in this year's growth, in the current year's trunk extension, I snapped off like the top inch of it.
I was literally just going to say to do that.
And I actually don't know what the result is going to be. It's going to make needle buds, right?
It shifts a little bit of the growth down below, and you'll get a really dense cluster of new things up at the top. In fact, sometimes they do that on their own naturally.
Right.
And that's kind of the clue, is when you grow a lot of pines, you can start seeing those patterns. And so one of the cool things, when you cut the tree down to one shoot, weird things can happen. Usually the number of needles in a bud is set, and you'll get, 10 inches worth of candle, or whatever that size of the candle happens to be. But if you've cut all the side ones off, that candle can just kind of magically keep elongating for an extra month or two longer than it normally would, and it can become incredibly long. Another thing that can happen is that you'll get your initial flush in spring, and it'll give you a second or third flush later in the growing season. Sometimes those flushes will be an elongation of the central leader. Sometimes they produce tons and tons of side buds, which is what you'll see when you break off the top. Because I've had those damaged, whether by me or by birds or who knows what, or just bumping it. And you do get a lot of buds. I've found that when you only take the top off, it actually doesn't make the bottom that much stronger, because you still have all those other needles up there, and you still have, the tree is still incentivized to keep investing up high rather than down low. And so when it gets really weak down low, I haven't found a better way than cutting off most of the upper part of the branch, which is no fun, because then it slows you down, and it takes a couple years to get that momentum back on the sacrifice branch.
Yeah, but you end up with a lot of branches. In fact, you end up
Probably
with too many branches.
And so they need thinning usually at multiple times, once or twice during the growing season, and then definitely a full once over in fall.
So it takes a lot of time essentially to reestablish the growth pattern that you had before, because you have to thin out all those buds and remove all the ones, make sure you don't get reverse taper and that kind of thing. Yeah,
So I do that on purpose sometimes, because sometimes if I'm doing more aggressive bends on them when they're young, they'll break. Or if I work on them in year 3 instead of year 2, and they'll just snap. And so if I keep it, if the roots are good, I'll keep it, because then I get a ton of buds on it. And yeah, it'll take a couple years to get there, but sometimes those end up being the best trees, especially for shohin, because then you've got all the branches you need and they're distributed all the way around the trunk, as opposed to just on the top, which is another struggle that we've both noticed.
The top being the side of the lower trunk that is facing upward rather than like the top of the sacrifice branch is what you're talking about.
Yes. So to set that one up, let's say you put one helix bend at the base of a pine and then let a sacrifice grow up 2, 3, 4 feet above that. When you do finally make a big cut, you'll get a lot of buds, but typically you'll only get them on the needles facing the sun. So on the sides and the top of that initial bend right near the soil. And so what I don't know is, how do you make buds pop on the part of the branch or trunk facing downward? The tree does not want to produce buds there. And so I've made a lot of trees that are just always not as nice as they'd be if they had additional buds there. And I think the way you do that is you don't worry about them when they're really young, and then you grow kind of a secondary section of trunk, and then that one has different buds all the way around. And as you point those down, then you get more branches.
Actually, that's a really good point. I hadn't actually been worrying about getting buds on the lower, on the underside of the low trunk curves, because I just figured that I'm going to be bending branches down from above on all sides.
If you have one section of taper in the tree, you'll notice that that's a flaw. And I've done too many trees with one section of taper where you have a big curve and then everything comes down. That's limiting. But if you're growing multiple sections of the trunk, then you can do more over time.
Which brings us to the topic of transitioning from sacrifice branch number 1 to sacrifice branch number 2. Yes. But before we do that, let's circle back to the beginning of the conversation, which was we started actually talking about how to teach this. Do you think that podcasts, we've just described a lot of pine scenarios and anatomy. Do you think that podcasts are an effective way to teach people pine technique?
It might meet an emotional need, but and it'll make people very curious to know what the details are or to be able to point to an example of what we're talking about. But I would guess if you haven't done this before, that it's not the most actionable information. If you've done it before, then you kind of know how to manage the upper growth, how to manage the lower growth. But I don't know how arming someone with just this info, unless you're really good at abstract stuff, would be the most valuable way alone.
So maybe we need to point someone at like some drawings or something.
And diagram number 3. Yeah.
You have plenty of photos on your website that probably show almost everything that we just talked about.
As do your videos on YouTube, same kind of thing.
Yeah. So I think 2 of the biggest teaching platforms out there right now belong to bonsai professionals in the United States who are using video to teach this kind of thing. So, and video seems to be the way that people are going, but you're writing a book.
Yes. And that, luckily I have a lot of practice writing about bonsai, which helps a lot. But just last night, I was actually thinking about something I wanted to include in the book. And I thought, well, I know how I do that with video. How would I do that on paper? But the one thing I figured out about video is when there's a video on a topic, it makes me think before I watch it, oh, bummer, I wanted to do a video on that. And then I end up watching that other video and I think, oh, actually, you need about 100 videos on that topic before that's adequately covered. I think we often watch a video on a topic and think, oh, I know that or I understand that. But as I've learned in writing blog posts about very specific techniques, it's actually the exact same thing for video. For a 5 or 10 minute video, you can cover a very specific topic, a tiny topic. And so when someone says, here's what you need to know about topic X in bonsai, and you watch that 10-minute video, if their scope is anything other than a specific technique or a specific phase of something, then it's just going to be really cursory information, and you'll need another half dozen videos to get through that. And I'm actually hoping that going forward, we're going to see more people biting off less in their videos. And rather than giving us 2 hours and pretending we'll be experts at the end of that 2 hours, is give us much more in-depth focused videos on specific topics or stages.
You know what's interesting about YouTube is that the videos actually have to be a little bit entertaining to keep people watching them, right? So like,
Or more than a little bit entertaining.
right. Yeah. So, I mean, this, in some ways, this is a pretty dry topic. You're just like showing, you're showing yourself talking and trimming a tree. And so I find it really fun actually to film and edit videos, and then in the editing process have funny things come up where, the visual starts to look really interesting, even though you never really intended it. And that becomes a little bit more entertainment than education, maybe, or a mix of the two. But yeah, I've also found myself editing videos more and more aggressively. It takes, it initially, took me a half an hour to just, edit some video together and take out the parts where I'm not actually sitting in the chair or whatever, and that kind of thing, or making some loud sound. But then I started spending up to like 2 days editing a 4-minute video. And the result is a lot more fun to watch. It's a lot more interesting, but I'm not sure that it actually, I mean, maybe it gets the point across better, but maybe it's just a better combination of entertainment and information.
Whatever's going to engage people the most, I think, is almost the most valuable thing, because pretty much everyone agrees you have to do it at some level. There's got to be a hands-on component, and ideally a hands-on component reinforced by feedback from someone else. And so anything that gets people enthusiastic, gets them in the garden, or makes them curious about doing something, that might be one of the more important things that a learning material can provide.
So maybe to pair with your book and my e-course, we need to actually start running more Black Pine workshops.
Because without that, it's going to be tricky. And honestly, with that, it's really tricky, because what Eric and I were just talking about before recording is what our experiences were working on our trees in workshops where, the workshop leader would have to be working on a 3-year-old pine 1 minute, a 20-year-old pine the next minute, and then a Japanese maple the next minute. And so it kind of dissuaded people from paying attention to what other people were working on, because it was obviously totally unrelated to what they were doing. And then even when multiple people were working on the same thing, say if you and I were working on young trees, if they were at different stages, we might be curious. It's like, oh, what's coming up next? Or, oh, how might I have done that other step differently? But without that skin in the game, without that tangible reason to care, it just, again, becomes more academic or entertainment than anything else.
So in the last, or one of the recent episodes of Bonsai Wire, you talked to Sam Tan and Addison, both who are local to us and have come up really quickly. Do you think that's because the teaching and learning environment is better enabling people, giving them the tools to learn if they're really serious about it?
We tried to talk about that, and I think what became clear is that in both cases, what did it for them was partly the environment and the resources available to them, but I think even more so is they were driven to learn really quickly. And okay, I watched that video, now what? And so they found the answer to now what by finding someone else to work with, by finding a teacher to study with, or just buying more material and then playing with it and then sharing what they're doing. And that's one way that these people like Sam and Addison are finding each other, is by sharing that stuff online. And I think that whole environment is kind of what led to them coming up with what, from the outside, absolutely awesome results in an incredibly short amount of time.
Yeah, and I think it's, well, they're studying with different people or drawing from all kinds of different resources. I mean, I talk to Sam on a regular basis. He studied at Mirai, All right, but we're getting off topic.
But that one I think is kind of right on the topic, because that's just a good object lesson of what successful models of learning can look like. And in both cases, there were in-person components to that, is they digested what they could of what was available in online formats, whether in writing or in video, but also then following that up in person and by playing with trees and by sharing their progress and reaching out to others who are doing the same thing because they also shared their progress.
So maybe it's the level of intensity that they brought to it that allowed them to really jump in. Like, so I remember being at a at a San Francisco club meeting, and one of the older members turning to me and he's like, well, I come on the second Thursday of the month to the meeting, and then I come to the workshop on the third Thursday of the month. And there's only so many days per month that you can do bonsai. And I was thinking in my head, I was like looking at him with my brows furrowed and thinking in my head, well, yeah, there's 30 days in a month. I could do 30 days worth of bonsai, right? And you're only doing 2. I mean, so maybe the answer to learning all of this stuff is not, I mean, there's that seasonality aspect where, I tell people that I learned by taking a full day workshop once a month for 10 years, essentially. But I actually think if you were more just like an apprenticeship, if you were more intense about your learning process, not just doing it 1 day a month or 2 days a month, and maybe, a couple of weekend days, that maybe you would be able to pick up those techniques a lot faster, and that it would make more sense because you are not trying to pick up one piece at, 1 month and then, going back to work and worrying about spreadsheets, and then coming back the next month and trying to pick up a related piece of material and having to sort of like relearn it.
And that picks up on something else you were talking about earlier, is you found that there were occasions when, I really need to work on this tree, but I don't have a workshop, or I'm unable to attend the workshop this next month. I'm going to have to do it myself. And I think on my list of ultimate top level important bullet points is that idea of having ultimate responsibility for your collection, which means that whether you work on the tree, whether someone else works on the tree, or whether you do it in a workshop, that at some level doesn't matter. What matters is that you, as owner of the tree, make sure the tree's needs are met. And if you recognize that cutback is necessary or decandling is necessary, whatever it happens to be, repotting, that it gets done. And when you find that the tree needs it and you don't have a workshop available, your only choice is to either reach out to a friend and try to figure it out with them, or do it by yourself. And it's when you start doing things by yourself, apart from that workshop, so when you have a relationship with your trees outside of that social sphere, boy, does the learning happen quickly.
Yeah, I had a student reach out to me a couple of days ago because my June workshop was full, and he has a black pine that he wants to decandle. He's never decandled before. And I was like, okay, I'll just fit you in, just show up at this time. But his idea was just to wait until July to decandle it. And since he lives here in the Bay Area, that's pretty much too late. And if there's any health issues whatsoever with the tree, decandling in July could be a real big mistake, or at least set you back a little bit, so that you wouldn't be able to decandle next year. And that's why I felt it was really important to just sort of get him in there and get the tree decandled and show him kind of what to do. But yeah, I mean, to your point, I would look at the tree and think to myself, I can't wait to trim that. It's already like this overgrown, shrubby looking thing that needs to be thinned out. And you and I were also talking about thinning deciduous leaves, yeah. Which is, the timing is critical, because as soon as you leave them on there an extra 2 weeks,
you lose branches.
And we're talking about like trees that have a significant amount of ramification, not like a beginner's project that you picked up on a sales table, but the timing becomes really important in certain situations like that.
And it's funny, is on reflection, I don't know that we ever, and this might go for both of us, learned techniques for mature trees in workshops because all of our trees were young at the time. I feel like I've had to learn most of the techniques for mature trees on my own, because as the trees became more developed, that required different kinds of techniques. And it was only, not that many years ago when I realized you can't just keep decandling a pine forever. Their unlimited density just doesn't work at some point. And you need to start learning, how do you make those bigger cuts? And then how does cutback become as important as decandling? You're trying to reduce density as much as increase it, so you can maintain a full and dense crown. And that's tricky, and it's a completely different set of skills. And it doesn't matter how many workshops you take. If your trees aren't at that stage, you're not working on that problem.
So maybe that, kind of segues into the idea of, when we're talking about workshops, we're generally talking about bring your own tree workshops, but there are different possibilities for workshops. And, Michael Hagedorn does seasonals where the topics are very focused. And so, what I mentioned earlier about us doing black pine workshops, do you think that it would be more effective for people to bring their own trees to learn on to a black pine workshop, or to have the teacher provide the trees so that they were, well, maybe not all identical or all at the exact same stage, but were more focused on what the teacher was trying to convey for the day.
So that's kind of the biggest tension, I think, in in-person learning. I've found from doing intensives, if I choose the trees, they're going to be suited. They're exactly as hard or as easy as they need to be based on the person. The trees will all be healthy, and it'll be the perfect time of year to work on them. That's why the class was scheduled then. There is no faster learning that happens among students that I've witnessed in that environment, where the goal is not to finish the tree, but to learn a skill. When you're bringing your own tree, the odds that it's healthy, the odds that it's the right time of year, the odds that you're worried more about learning personal development than you are about making that tree advance are slim. Now, that said, there is room, I think, for people to bring their own trees, but that's what would make that successful, is the whole I'm afraid to mess it up gets in the way. Whereas if they're working on someone else's tree, yeah, you might be afraid, but if the tree is literally there for you to learn on, and you don't need to worry about whether or not you finish today, whether or not it's absolutely perfect, knowing that your interaction is going to be limited just to, how do I know which ones to cut or not cut? How do I know what density I'm aiming for? It's really hard to do that on your own trees.
You know, that's funny that as you were saying that, I'm thinking to myself, wait, what else fits into this situation? What else fits into this situation is an apprenticeship.
Yes.
You're not working on any of your own trees.
Nope.
And you have an endless supply of trees that you're being directed to work on at a particular time, you know, with a particular goal in mind. That, I wonder if that is actually one of the reasons why apprenticeships are so effective. I mean,
interestingly, the most important lessons of the apprenticeship aren't explicitly taught. The fact that you're working on it on that day is out of your control, but note to self, work on this tree on that day.
Well, that's one of the things that I find students struggle with is like, oh, what should I bring to workshop? Or they show up with something where you're just like, yeah, no, it's August and we're not touching our black pines this month. So I don't know why you brought that.
And calendars are probably the number one request I've ever received. And the reason I keep holding off writing it is because an actual calendar would have 0 dates on it, but it would all refer to different signs you're looking for based on the weather and what your trees are doing to know what to do.
Yeah, I mean, and decandling fits. Decandling is probably the best example of a date critical thing. I think I learned so much from pines that I could eventually apply to timing on other trees, because unlike so many other trees, like a juniper, there's 6 months out of the year, you can do something to it. But a pine, it's like there's 3 dates essentially that you're going to work on it. There's the repotting time in the spring, whatever your repotting interval when the buds start moving. There's your decandling date, which you have to determine kind of for yourself based on your local environment. And then there's fall thinning, which is also a little bit dependent on your location, because fall starts in different times of the year in different places, at least slightly. Yep. And so, but decandling becomes the big question. It's like, well, when do I decandle? It's like, well, you need to figure that out. So how do you figure that out? Or how do you teach people to figure that out?
And I remember that Boone did a great job of teaching, because he always described all of the things that go into it. And I remember taking notes year after year, and I think I came up with at one point 12 variables that affect when to do it.
Oh my God.
Yeah. But the simple answer is, I don't care where you live in the world, at some point, pick a day, June 15th, decandle, look at your tree in fall. And if it's too weak, do it sooner next time. And if it's too strong, do it, later next time. You kind of have to learn to course correct. And that means that the right day is determined on your feedback of your situation for your trees.
So that requires people to actually remember the date that they decandled in the prior year or prior 2-3 years, something like that.
Take a picture with your phone and it'll be time stamped. It could be that simple.
Yeah, or publish a YouTube video.
Or publish a YouTube video, yeah.
Yeah, no.
Because I don't take notes on my trees, but it's kind of insincere to say that, because I take a lot of photos and I can always see the dates of those photos. And I've done that where I'll actually look up a photo. When did I last repot that? I don't know. And you look at the photo and it'll tell you. It
is kind of handy to have photos that are all time and date stamped, like in order in a electronic device that's always in your pocket. I guess that is a pretty useful tool.
Yes, and I have about access to, I think, right around 50,000 images on my phone or any device I log into, and it's just really handy for being able to see that. I can just type in a species name, and then all of those shots will appear. It's really handy.
You have much better organization than I do.
Well, I'm also not saying it's ultimately helpful because I never went out of my way to make tags more specific than species. And when I type black pine, I think about 9,000 images show up. So I won't say it's a perfect system, but it's not bad for some things. Yeah, it's kind of funny. So you mentioned about the scheduling, the decandling thing for a student. I just did the exact same thing last week. I was actually on the phone with a student and he asked, well, when are you, or who else is in the workshop? I said, oh no, I'm scheduling this workshop around you and your tree. Like, when do you normally decandle? We're going to decandle a week or two earlier because we're going to cut into new needles. So you tell me what time that is and what works for schedule, and then I'll advertise a class around that because I want to make sure we're nailing the time for these trees. And that's the whole point of doing that. Like the one probably publicly available workshop that I'll be offering this year is just really to accommodate this, because I said I would do this 6 months ago. I still haven't had time to do classes yet because thanks to the book and some other projects.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, determining a workshop date, I mean, that allows you to sort of have feedback with the person that you're scheduling the workshop with based on their date or whatever. But I think what I figured out, or when I was thinking about the e-course and decandling, what I was trying to set, because maybe someone's in Australia, so it's not going to be June and July. So is it take the summer solstice as the base date, and so that's June 26th in the Northern Hemisphere or something like that?
Yeah, 21st second. Yeah.
Okay, 21st second. Yeah. And then if you're in a cooler area, decandle earlier. So I live in San Francisco, where the average nighttime summer temperature is about 50 degrees. Same in winter. Mm-hmm. So I actually decandle at the beginning of June, but you live only, as the bird flies, about 15 miles away from me across the bay, and you decandle even into July for smaller trees.
And I start as early as I've done it on May 15th.
But was that for the national show because
Yes.
you wanted the needles out by September?
Yeah, but I frequently start in May. Last week in May is common for my biggest trees.
That's interesting because Bernard is on the western half of San Francisco, which is even colder.
He never sees the sun.
And it's like all summer, it's just foggy. And we started decandling his pines in the middle of May, mm-hmm. which is still squarely spring. But we would get, because they'd sit there for a month afterwards, just doing absolutely nothing in the cold, then he would still get a nice compact set of needles by the end of the season. But we were decandling a full month to 6 weeks ahead of places that are only 100 miles away.
Which gets into what's challenging about teaching pine specific techniques is weather matters. And so, we get what's known as, June gloom, but it really continues through July and August around here, where we get fog in the morning. And on good days, it burns off early, and on bad days, it doesn't burn off. And we had the May gray this year, and pretty much we have not had but a couple days anywhere near 70 degrees for the last 6 weeks or something. In a normal year, I'm used to the day I finish decandling is the last time I see the sun for about 6-8 weeks. And the tree just sits there. Whereas if it were going to be sunny, that would really change anything. And I was actually having this discussion with Adam Toth recently, and I told him how early I start decandling, and his eyes half bugged out of his head. He could not believe how early. And I'm like, well, yeah, start looking at what the weather's like in this backyard compared to 5 miles away, let alone 15 miles away. And for something like pines, to follow what you said, it's a great model organism. It's a good species through which to learn other species because it keeps you honest timing-wise.
Yeah, I can't decide whether people are going to have any easier time figuring it out if I tell them, start from the summer solstice and work backwards or forwards based on your weather. But
it's not a bad starting point. What we're teaching is it doesn't matter what the buds look like when you cut them in spring. What matters is how many days are left in the growing season.
Well, that's the counterintuitive point that everybody was like, well, the needles are out. Should I decandle now? And it's like, no. It doesn't matter what the growth looks like in terms of the timing. The growth, how healthy the growth and how vigorous the growth is matters in terms of whether or not you're going to decandle, because if the tree's not healthy enough, you're not going to decandle. But
Yeah.
that's such a common question, is like, oh, the growth is out, should I cut it off? Well, no, you need to figure out what your decandling date is, and then it's the time from when you decandle until your fall weather sets in. That timeline is what's the important part.
And in general, for the Northern Hemisphere, if you're cutting sometime in June or July, you're in the ballpark. And what I'm surprised is how many times pines are decandled outside of that range. A year has not gone by when I've seen a pine where it had been decandled at the wrong time of year and there are 0 buds the following year.
Well, so let's talk for a minute about the old school landscaper technique of just cutting off all the spring candles. I've seen people in bonsai nurseries doing that, but I've actually never seen the result. I would imagine you just pretty much end up with the same thing again.
The pinching the candles where you keep some of the candle? Or?
No, removing the whole thing.
Oh, that early? It just kind of keeps pines. It doesn't really do a whole lot. Instead of having 4 or 5 shoots, you'll have 6 or 8 shoots at every tip if it's strong. And if it's not strong, it does very little. It just slightly slows it down.
I also had someone ask me, why don't you just prune in the fall? Then you don't have to deal with a second flush of growth. And I didn't know how to answer that question.
Well, that's how pines were grown for a million years up until decandling was developed, and you end up keeping the spring internodes, which are super long.
Right. So decandling is giving you better back budding. I mean, I think my answer to him was that you actually have to prune twice a year. And because the trees, at least in many environments, if you live in, I think people from Western Canada and Washington State have told me that they can only decandle every other year. So there's certainly, if you live in a cold enough climate, the trees are not going to be quite as vigorous as they would be in a warmer climate. Mm-hmm. But I think for most people, you have to decandle in June, removing all of that spring growth and maybe some of last year's summer growth. And then you have to thin and touch things up in the fall to make sure that it doesn't stay too dense through the winter.
Yep. And so, yeah, it is a twice a year pruning. And that actually is something I'm working on for the book, where before I get to any specific techniques of how to do anything with any species, I'm introducing the concept that there are annual cycles for most species. And that means at some point, when you're working on a new tree, you're going to be measuring how long is it going to take to get on track. When it's a pine, when is it healthy enough you can do those 3 things, whether it's your repotting, your decandling, your fall work, what is it going to take to get on that cycle? And then you're going to stay on that cycle. For deciduous trees, it's making sure they are thinned in the middle of the growing season. And always there's repotting at one end of the season. There is maintaining light in the interior in the middle of the growing season. And then there's a structural and more aesthetic work at the end of the season and fall. That's kind of the basic pattern, but I really want to focus. It's never been taught that way to me, but that's one way to kind of simplify what it is we do with all of our trees, which kind of dispels some of the mystery about what kind of stuff you do when. Because a lot of times people are told, do this on this day, and then it's really hard to know, well, why or why not? Or what if I can't,
Yeah, I don't think that calendars or even, certainly a calendar with dates on it is not going to get you very far. But even a calendar that would be based on natural signs would get you only so far beyond that. So you really have to think about, well, okay, learn the annual cycle for a given species, and then think about why you're doing each thing at a particular time. Yeah. And then modify either your timing or your technique to account for the health of the tree or the size of the tree, because like I said before, we're decandling black pines later in the season because that makes the needles shorter for the winter. But the same thing is true, I guess, for certain deciduous species. Mm-hmm. I'm actually blanking right now on.
Yeah, but like, when are you going to defoliate? Are you going to fully or partially defoliate? Like, some of these technical details exist with a lot of other species. They're just often a little more enumerated for pines and others. And the basics are pretty darn straightforward. The question always gets into the details, and honestly, experience is kind of the easiest way around that, which gets us back to get those trees to a workshop, or better yet, a study group, or better yet, kind of a seasonal type experience.
Yeah. So when should we expect your book to be out?
Oh, that's not for another year and a half at this point. I think we're talking winter of 25.
Huh. Well, that is a while.
1 year of writing, and then half a year of editing, and then half a year of typesetting, printing, and all that.
Maybe you should have just self-published it on Amazon.
Yeah, it's tempting. Actually, the reason I went with a publisher in the first case is I wanted it to be a better overall book, because I thought, am I an expert at typesetting? Nope. Am I an expert at photography? Definitely not. Am I a great editor? No. I work really well with all of those people. And so I thought I could learn more working with a publisher, because then they can take care of all that stuff, which is really great. You don't get any of that for your course. You have people look at it, but you're still doing the video editing. You're doing the cinematography. You're the on-air talent as well.
I'll tell you that you want to know the hardest thing about making that e-course was if you have to figure out how to use Adobe After Effects, it is going to take you a while. And so the situation came up where you and I had discussed, how do we make sure that we're communicating the season properly visually to the people as they're watching these videos? And I thought to myself, I don't even know. And so I could put like a little tag down in the corner that says spring, but that's not very fun. So then I went down this huge rabbit hole watching YouTube videos about how to use Adobe After Effects completely. I felt like I was doing a programming language or something like that with how complicated it gets. But in the end, I made 4 animated graphics, one for each season, that I can overlay on the videos to communicate to people, okay, this is what you're doing in the summer, and this is what you're doing in the spring, and this is what you're doing in the fall. There's not a whole lot that you're really doing in winter, so to speak, because I would consider repotting to be a spring activity more than a winter activity. Mm-hmm. But that was a complete rabbit hole. So that's my typesetting. I just typeset a whole book trying to figure out how to make one graphic.
And depending on how fun or timely it would take to be the second one, maybe you'll put all that energy into finding someone who can do this next time. It takes an army to do these things. It's kind of surprising.
Well, it took me, I think it's been almost exactly a year since I started filming the e-course.
Yeah.
And that was because I knew that I had to film some videos. If you're going to teach black pine, you're going to have the trees be seasonally appropriate to show the right work. I can't show a decandling technique if I'm filming all the videos in the winter. So,
and what I found is not only can you not film everything at one time, but if you only ever show someone one stage at a time, it doesn't fit as well. So I think the animation is going to be helpful. You've drawn it in blog posts in the past where first you do this and then you do that, and this is what you expect. And I think until people kind of see the effect of what happens, it's a lot harder for it to make sense. There's kind of nothing to it. The trees grow in spring, you cut that off, they grow again in summer. Like, that's it. It seems like it gets more complicated than that, but like that's kind of all that there is to it. The rest is just fairly minor details that are more incremental, and how do we optimize? And I think that's maybe a big part of the whole pine mystique, which is a lot of concern about the optimizations rather than the core things. When someone brings us a tree, it's never about the optimizations. It's more, is it healthy enough to work on? Has it been fertilized well in spring? Do we have a good expectation of it responding well to whatever work we have lined up for it? That's usually the primary concern.
I don't know if it's that simple. I think I don't know why it's more complicated, because I agree with you. Like, I could distill it down to the same, 3 operations or whatever, but somehow it doesn't.
There's sub-operations.
It just doesn't work out. I mean, if you tell somebody that, just trim it in spring and then trim it again in fall, you're going to end up with something that doesn't look anything like the bonsai that we like to grow.
No, and our bonsai didn't look like that when we started either, so understandably.
Interesting.
But we also were able to make these trees having not done it before. And that's one of the bigger points to convey is when we started growing pines from seed, we hadn't done it before. And we weren't looking at examples of other people who had done it. And we didn't have people who had done it to ask questions of. Now we have we have examples of this having been done. We have done this. We have been able to answer questions for people who are doing it. And so, yeah, there's a lot to it, but somehow we figured it out and we're able to make it happen without those resources. And now there's lots of resources for figuring out how this stuff can be done.
Yeah.
And so I'll be curious what kind of feedback we get about whether it's directly to this conversation or from your course or from, various articles. Where are there still gaps, or what parts of the country might have unique concerns? I know you mentioned the Pacific Northwest, whole different ballgame decandling up there because it's not every year and the timing and frequency is much more up for grabs. Whereas down in the Southeast, it's more a matter of how late can we do it and how aggressive can we be, because the idea is more about slamming on the brakes than it is on stepping on the gas.
Yeah, and to that point, I am actually looking for people to give me feedback about the course, because I don't think that it can't just be static. Like, you can't launch a course and expect it to meet everybody's needs. I guess that's why they do editions in the book world. But, so adding information that's more specific to southern climates versus northern climates, or we're kind of sitting in the middle where we live. But I think that kind of thing is what I'm looking for feedback about.
Yeah. No, that'll be fun. I know that publishing anything about bonsai is one of the best ways to learn, because you're going to get feedback whether you want to or not. And often those really innocent questions are the absolute best kinds of feedback for us. Oh, what do you do about that? Or that? It's like, oh yeah, that is a really natural question. How could I explain that in a different way? Or how might I make this apply to people that live in different climates? That's really handy.
So I look forward to getting to give you some feedback on that book, but we're going to have to wait 18 months.
Yeah, you're probably going to get bits of that sooner. The manuscript's due in just a matter of months at this point, and so it's getting closer. I think I can't expect, this book will be a lot longer than the first one, and I expect no one to slog through that all, but I might be sharing bits and pieces of it for feedback, as that's a lot easier to digest.
So now that you've got your house remodeled and you're on your second book initiative, what's the next big project that you're going to pile on yourself?
I was actually up late last night thinking about that exact thing. And just yesterday, I came up with a fun idea. I'm just not sure it's technically possible, feasible, or desirable. But what actually led to this whole discussion is a few days ago, Eric and I were talking about how do you kind of break through the noise? How do you come up with ways of sharing information about bonsai that make it entertaining? In other words, we want to be educational. We want to be able to share as much of this as possible. But if it's not fun, people are just not going to do that. And so I thought, well, rather than try to be the most hardcore about how do I find a resource that's going to be discoverable, or how do I make something that's going to be an obvious hit, because there obviously are no secrets for that, I thought, well, what sounds like fun for me? If I'm going to be slogging and teaching myself some new technique, like you dredging around the After Effects underworld, I just thought, well, what would be a fun kind of thing to do? And so a few ideas came to mind. I'll have to think about whether or not I want it to exist. And literally, I don't even know if it's possible, but I just was trying to think specifically for Pines, Lila, and other topics, what would be a more immersive, fun way to digest the content that involves, video, words, images, whatever's most useful for which bits of it. Because I still think words are helpful. Having watched 2-hour videos for a single piece of information, I just want to know when to do this thing. I don't want to watch a 2-hour video for it. I found that words are not the most helpful when you're describing how to wire something. I've learned that, images are absolutely fantastic in some things, unless you want it to be a little more three-dimensional, and then you want to rely on the video. So they each have their sweet spot. And so I was literally thinking of some kind of a fantastical multimedia adventure that might be fun to work on. So that's what would be next.
Maybe like a a book paired with the new Apple VR headset.
Yeah, at the current price points, that seems totally reasonable. But yes, something that would involve multiple modes, and hopefully not glasses that make you dizzy. Well, where will people learn more about your course? Is it available now? What's the status of that?
They can check it out on bonsify.com. There is actually a pop-up if you go looking for it, but it's also in the e-course section of the top nav. And if you normally follow me on YouTube, you can also find a couple of previews there. I just published a video this morning that talks about decandling a large black pine, but the course is specifically about shohin, so there's a link to it from that video as well.
Nice. Did you make a couple sample videos available, or at least snippets available, so people could get an idea about what it's like?
There are 2 full videos available, one of which is kind of like the goals of the course, to make sure that people understand that it's not a course that teaches you everything about black pines, because I just don't think that's possible.
Oh, that's disappointing. Come on. You don't cover everything?
Let alone everything about growing every species from seed to maturity. It does not do that. So I wanted to make sure that people understood that this is sort of like a recipe. Like the course is really intended to create one of a very limited number of styles of Japanese black pine.
Which happens to be a style that lots of people are looking for, specifically as interest in shohin has been growing so rapidly around the country, at least.
It's true, yeah.
So it'll be very fun. So thank you. Anything else you wanted to add to all that?
I think that was it.
Thanks so much for coming by and chatting.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
The music on today's podcast was brought to you by the fine folks at Blue Dot Sessions. Check them out at www.sessions.blue.